Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thank you for joining me for another episode of DeeDee Does History. So today I want to continue my positive vibes of history. I went looking through a channel that I've been watching a fair bit of called Simple History. And I've got a nice little pack of 3 videos that I haven't checked out yet. They're quite short, but I really like their style. And I'm glad that I get to highlight them here. And so if you enjoy these, you could definitely they're snack-sized little videos, so you could go through a lot of them. The information for the channel and the videos that I review are, of course, in the description below. So if you could go through, if you enjoyed them, give them a like, support these creators, because we always want to do that. There's so much great content on YouTube, and it's because of support of people like you watching. So we'll get right into this first video on how the Soviets reacted to the moon landings.
When we think about the moon landings, it's often seen through the lens of an American victory in the space race. What isn't often discussed is how the USSR, America's rival, reacted to the landings. Was its government upset about not being the first to the moon, or were they excited about such a major event in human history? The space race was a, race to space between the USSR and the USA during the 1960s. Well, sort of. It was more about creating delivery vehicles for nuclear weapons to destroy each other, but there was some sciencing in the meantime. The USSR was initially in the lead, having put an object in orbit and then being the first to put a man into space. In the end, though, it was the Americans who got there first, with Neil Armstrong being the first man to walk on the moon. Incidentally, the Soviet lunar program was conducting an unmanned mission at the time the astronauts were on the moon, which failed and crashed into the surface. So after this, how did the Soviets react? Did they try to suppress it or claim that it didn't happen? Nope.
I wasn't aware of that there was an unmanned mission to the moon by the Soviets. I did know about Sputnik, of course, the satellite that they put up, and I believe the first astronaut in space was Yuri Gagarin. He's revered in Russia, and even the Russian KHL, their end-of-the-year trophy, their equivalent of the Stanley Cup, is the Gagarin Cup, named after Yuri Gagarin, a pioneer of Soviet space exploration.
Nope. First of all, footage of the landings was shown on Soviet television, but frankly not many Soviet citizens owned a television, and thus it wasn't something many could watch. It was quickly reported afterwards in the national media, although it wasn't front-page news, but simply listed as a run-of-the-mill story. One thing the Soviets didn't speak of was the failure of their lunar lander. They waited until the timing was a bit less embarrassing. Furthermore, the Soviet government congratulated the Americans on their success and spoke of a future joint mission to the moon. This was mostly just friendly overtures, by the way. Both the USSR and the USA were becoming increasingly frustrated by the costs of their space programs. Conveniently, the USSR also changed its mind on its own moon program, and it declared that such landings were dangerous and self-indulgent. In terms of leadership, it's hard to know how any of them felt on a personal level, since, secretive communist state. It's also pretty easy to imagine that cosmonaut Alexei Leonov would have been pretty disappointed. Why? Because he had been selected by Soviet leadership to be the first man on the moon had the Soviets got there first. Another person of influence in the USSR who was known to be furious was the former First Secretary Nikita Khrushchev. The Soviet space program was his doing, and for him, not being the first to the moon demonstrated that the Soviet Union was losing its way. So what about the Soviet people and the broader communist bloc? Many simply didn't hear much about it or weren't too fussed about America's scientific endeavours. There were some who were upset with the USSR seeming to lose to the Americans, but barring that, the response to it was exceptionally muted. It was only really the scientists who'd worked for the USSR's own space program that had any sort of publicly positive response to it. And across the broader Warsaw Pact? Well, frankly, the event didn't receive much coverage there either. The primary reason being that many of its governments were, at the time, commemorating 20 years of communist rule. So, in conclusion, as many of you would expect, the Soviet response to the moon landings was mixed and not very public. The leadership had wanted to get to the moon first, but had failed to do so. And given the timing of their own failed mission, they felt little need to make too much fuss about it. The USSR, along with its puppet states, were focused on the 20th anniversary of communism in Eastern Europe, which overshadowed the American achievement. For what it's worth, despite the USSR's lack of enthusiasm, they did congratulate the Americans. And frankly, their response was a lot more positive than the American one to Sputnik had been. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you for watching, with extra thanks to my Patreon supporters, which you can see on screen. And with
That was pretty cool. A couple of things I didn't know, especially that unmanned lunar mission. And they indicate right there in the video that was something that they didn't make a big deal about, and surprisingly, I hadn't heard about that until now. So, learned something. So let's move on quickly to the next video, which is going to be a little historical deal about why the West uses Arabic numerals.
As you'll know, the Western world predominantly uses Arabic numerals for mathematics, but it never used to. For millennia, Roman numerals were used. But why were they replaced? What led to Europe and the Western world adopting Arabic numerals? Throughout the life of the Roman Empire and the millennium after its collapse in the West, Roman numerals were the only game in town. Side note, in case you're wondering, much of Eastern Europe used the Cyrillic numeral system of the Bulgarian Empire until Peter the Great's reforms in the 18th century. Anyway, whilst Roman numerals might appear to be complicated when trying to use them in mathematics, everyone in Europe had only ever known them. It was obvious to everyone back then that Xiv plus Xvir equals L, obviously. All joking aside, this had been the way that things had been done for thousands of years, so why did they change, and how? Arabic numerals, called so because they came to Europe through trade with the Arabic world, they actually originated in India by the way, were first introduced to Europe in the 9th century. And in fact, Pope Sylvester II was heavily in favour of their use, but they never took off. It wasn't until the 13th century that Arabic numerals began to spread to merchants.
Interesting little point, if you noticed, when they had the numerals there, they had 1 through 9. Because in the Western world, at this point in history, the concept of a number 0 didn't even exist yet. Arab mathematicians, as far as I know, were the ones who introduced the idea of a number 0. Seems weird to our sensibilities that there could ever be a time that wasn't representable by a number, but there you have it. In Roman numerals, there's no way to represent 0. There's a lot of other letters and weird combinations for everything else.
Some, or perhaps much of this, was down to the work of Leonardo of Pisa, better known as Fibonacci, who basically wrote a mathematical textbook which argued that Arabic numerals were superior. Fibonacci's arguments for adopting were convincing, and many merchants in Pisa adopted the new system, at least temporarily, since it was soon afterwards banned. There were two main reasons for this, which are also why it took so long for Arabic numerals to be adopted in the rest of Europe. One, the new system was open to fraud. With Roman numerals, merchants would use a flick with the last I in a number to mark that it was the last one, something hard to tamper with. Whereas anyone could turn a 3 into an 8 and make it look like somebody owed more money than they did. And reason number 2, because the system was imported from the Islamic world, it made Christian leaders and merchants uneasy, who often at the very least saw the use of it as being unchristian. And in the eyes of church leaders, it also promoted trade with the Islamic world, which was seen as a no-no. This setback took another 2 centuries to overcome when Arabic numerals started popping up all over Europe. Renaissance universities were quick to start instruction in Arabic numerals, yet they took centuries to spread, because bankers and merchants didn't attend university and so were instructed in the better understood Roman numerals. And another reason was because of cultural conservatism. Roman numerals had been used literally for millennia and were good enough for the Romans, so why change anything? It was only when the Renaissance really took off and old institutions were for the first time questioned that the use of Roman numerals were queried. The new leaders in Italy were students of the Renaissance, and many, like the Medici banking family, brought Arabic numerals with them. For them, it was the efficiency in mathematics. As an example, we'll do 13 times 13 in Roman numerals. 2 columns, one of the numbers being multiplied in each, add a new line, halve the number in the left column and double the number in the right. You keep going until the half number gets to 1, then cross out any rows where the number in the left column is even. Add the right column together, and there's your answer, hence why we got rid of them. Thereafter, leaving only monarchs in the occasional calendar still using Roman numerals. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and a special thanks to all my Patreon supporters, James Bisonet,
and the Rocky movies. So, I like Roman numerals for small numbers and just for representing things. It's kind of a historical quirk now, but boy, doing math with them would be nigh impossible, and without a concept of 0, a lot of math would be straight up impossible. You see how cultural factors and religious factors play into something as seemingly unrelated as the numbers we write down. So that's a great little piece of information. I do like those small touches of the earlier video, the earlier tableau there not having the 0 on it, and then the later one as they were teaching them in the Renaissance having it. That was pretty cool. Little details. Again, history matters, the simple history. And here's my last video for today, and this one is on why Canada didn't join the American Revolution. In case you didn't know, I'm Canadian. There may be a little more Canadian content coming up. Let's get to this one and see if we find something interesting about it as well.
When the American War for Independence broke out, 13 of Britain's North American colonies opted to sever ties with the mother country. However, some of those colonies chose to remain loyal and afterwards would go on to form the Dominion of Canada. Thus the question is, why didn't Canada join the American Revolution? Before continuing, it's important to stress that in 1775, Canada didn't exist. It was instead comprised of the colonies of Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, Quebec, Rupert's Land and St. John's Island. Barring Quebec, the differences between the peoples of these states and those of the 13 colonies were no more or less stark. Before it can be determined why all of the colonies didn't leave, it's necessary to know why the 13 that did leave chose to break away in the first place. Much of the anger directed at Britain was due to the idea that the recent acts of King George III and his parliament violated the rights of Englishmen. This is why the province of Quebec had no interest in revolting, since, it wasn't English. Speaking of Quebec, it was itself one of the reasons for the revolution. The Quebec Act had expanded the size of the French-speaking colony and granted freedom of religion there, which to the Protestant English-speaking colonies surrounding them was terrible. For Quebec, its options were to stay with Britain, whom they didn't exactly like but had granted them rights and more territory, or to the rebels who despised them. But what about when the French began to help the Americans? Didn't Quebec want to go back to being under French rule? Well, no. Being a British colony gave Quebec access to a much larger international trading market, and also, to put it bluntly, the French didn't really care about it anymore. Another reason for the American Rebellion is what are known as the Intolerable Acts. Things like the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act and the Quartering Act took away rights and privileges that American colonists had previously held, which shockingly upset them. The taxes that Britain imposed were done so without the consent of the Americans, leading to cries of no taxation without representation, to which Britain's response was, the people living in Britain itself barely have representation, so what makes you so special? Also, mass financial problems across the colonies, combined with the ban on expanding westward in order to prevent war with the Indians, meant that revolution wasn't too far away. Some of these acts, combined with economic issues, negatively affected the peoples of the later Canadian colonies just as badly. Unlike the 13 colonies, though, the reaction wasn't quite as fierce there. In places like Rupert's Land and St. John's Island, the acts weren't quite as important, since their economies relied on natural resource extraction. Whereas in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, the acts were just as disruptive. These colonies did see some resistance to British policies. Nova Scotia had close ties to New England, and much of its population were immigrants from there. Thus, they too were angry at the new taxes, and this anger culminated in a couple of riots, but ultimately no more than that. Much of this was down to the province being much less urbanised, and so what little resistance there was couldn't be organised quickly. Nova Scotia's economy was also reliant on the British military, since Halifax was a garrison town which played host to many Royal Navy vessels. Another factor which secured their allegiance was that British troops were needed to fight off Indian raiding. Speaking of which, raiding by American privateers during the war drastically soured the relationship between Nova Scotia and the 13 rebelling colonies and guaranteed further that Nova Scotia would remain loyal to Britain. As for Newfoundland, many of its residents were fishermen who had either relocated from Britain recently or were there for a season to work, and thus inclusion in the British Empire was necessary for their livelihoods. Whilst Newfoundland had many problems similar to those in the American colonies, its distance meant that it lacked a sense of solidarity with those to its south. Thus, they saw themselves not as colonists, but as being entirely British, and most there believed that their problems would not be solved by political separation. There were two other important reasons for Nova Scotia and Newfoundland remaining loyal. The first was that the elites of the colonies hadn't lost any money from Britain's actions, like those in, say, Virginia or in Massachusetts. They were mostly naval officers whose income came from their own lands back in Britain and whose position relied on loyalty. Reason number two was a simple one: proximity. It was quicker to sail to Newfoundland and Nova Scotia than any of the American colonies, meaning that any retaliation that did happen would have hit them first, and that was not a tantalising proposition for them. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you for watching.
That last little bit made a lot of sense, yeah. I mean, that's why where I live in eastern Canada, in those areas, a lot of immigration came through here in St. John and places like Newfoundland, but especially once we were officially part of Canada, a lot of immigration came through here just because it was easier to sail to here than it was to sail all the way to Boston or New York. And so people would immigrate here, gather their money, and a lot of times move on. If you want to hear a little more about that kind of thing, I've done a previous series of videos on the Irish potato famine and the massive amounts of immigration that caused specifically into my city and into Canada and the eastern US as well. That was quite a fascinating journey, and I added a lot of information and discovered a lot of things about that one. So I really hope that you enjoyed the videos that I have here by the channel. I think I misnamed them originally, but History Matters. That will be in the description as always. If you look through, they have tons of videos, and most of them are kind of bite-sized, about 3 to 4 minutes. So there's just a lot of information, and for me, I could go down this rabbit hole for hours watching these types of videos, but like I've said before, I try to avoid that because I like to react to them the first time through. For that last video, sorry I had more reactions to my guest star, Cleo. So I hope you enjoyed that. She's going to make herself and her presence known sometimes whether I want it or not. So I accept that. Cat ownership is its own thing. But I thank you so much for joining me for the channel today. I hope that you enjoyed these videos. Like I said at the beginning, the details on those videos and this channel all going to be in the description below. If you want to help support me, one of the easiest ways is to leave a comment. It has one of the biggest impacts on my videos getting seen. So if you leave a comment, whether you like this, whether you didn't like it, what you want to see me cover. And tomorrow I should be back with one more positive vibes, happy history story, and then we'll see what goes on next week. But again, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you learned something. Stay safe and have an awesome day.